Welcome to the Book Voices channel. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest book discussions. Now let's dive into today's book.
All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know how this works. We're taking the sources you've all shared, and we're going to try to pull out those really valuable insights, those nuggets of gold that make you feel, like you really understand a topic without having to wade through mountains and mountains of books and articles and, all that stuff. And today, we're diving deep into something I think a lot of us have heard of, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie.
Oh, it's such a classic, yeah. I mean, can you believe this book first came out way back in 1937?
It's almost 100 years old.
And the first printing was like tiny, just 5,000 copies.
Wow.
But it like really struck a chord, like it touched on something so fundamental about how we interact with each other.
Absolutely.
That it became this global phenomenon. I mean, it's been translated into practically every language out there,
Yeah.
And even the title itself, it's become part of our everyday language. We all know it, we quote it, we even make fun of it sometimes. But the fact that it's still so relevant today, almost a century later, that tells you something about its power.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting to me is the origin story of the book. Because it didn't come out of nowhere. It actually grew out of Dale Carnegie's adult education courses.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And back in the 1930s, the University of Chicago and the United YMCA schools, they actually did a survey of adults. And they asked them, what are you most eager to learn? What do you really want to know more about? And after health, which makes sense, right?
Yeah, sure.
The number one topic was all about people. How do we understand them? How do we build rapport with them? How do we get them to like us? And even how do we influence their thinking?
Well, and the thing is, what's really fascinating there is that even though people clearly wanted to learn about this, there wasn't a good book about it.
Exactly.
Like no one had written that practical go-to guide.
Yeah.
So Carnegie basically had to create his own curriculum from scratch. And he didn't just sit in his office and dream it up. He did tons of research. Like he actually interviewed a huge range of successful people.
Oh, wow.
Inventors like Marconi and Edison, political figures like Franklin D. Roosevelt and James Farley, business tycoons like Owen D. Young, even like movie stars like Clark Gable and Mary Pickford.
I mean, that's an impressive network.
Right. He wanted to understand their methods, like their specific techniques for dealing with people and navigating relationships.
It's almost like a masterclass in human interaction, just from those interviews alone.
Totally.
And his teachings, I mean, they really evolved over time.
Yeah, for sure.
He started with like a short talk.
Mm-hmm.
And then that grew into like a 90-minute lecture.
Right.
And then over 15 years, working with thousands and thousands of adults, it finally took shape as the principles that we see in the book.
It wasn't just theory. It was like tested and refined in the real world.
Exactly. And the preface, if you go back to the beginning of the book, it shares some incredible stories, like this business owner with over 300 employees.
Yeah.
And just by applying these principles, he saw, huge improvements in profit and personal time and just his overall happiness.
That's amazing.
Right. And then there are countless stories about people who, they got promotions or they had more success in sales.
It's really about unlocking a different level of potential in ourselves,
Wow.
when it comes to interacting with other people. And the book actually, it quotes Professor William James, who famously said that most of us, we only use a small fraction of our mental and physical capabilities.
Yes, it is true.
And Dr. John G. Hibben, he was the former president of Princeton, he defined education as the ability to effectively navigate all of life's situations.
Wow.
So for you, think of this deep dive as a way to uncover and develop those those hidden strengths in the realm of human connection.
Okay, so that's the kind of overarching theme here.
Yeah.
But how can you really get the most out of this, this deep dive, and more importantly, how can you really absorb and apply the lessons from the book?
Right.
Well, the preface, it actually lays out a really clear strategy.
Yeah.
And the advice is just as relevant today
Yeah.
as it was back then.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's not just about, reading it quickly. It's about cultivating this deep desire to really master these principles.
Mm-hmm.
Read each chapter slowly, maybe even read them more than once.
Yeah.
Stop and really think about how you can implement these ideas in your own daily life.
Right.
Underline the key points, review the material regularly, they suggest monthly, and this is really important, actually apply the principles at every opportunity. Treat the book like a practical handbook, like a tool that you can use.
I love that like it's really about actively engaging with the material. It's not, passively just absorbing the information. Yeah. It's about actually thinking about it, reflecting on it, and then trying out the concepts in your own life.
Yeah, that's where the magic happens, right?
Exactly.
All right, let's dive into the first principle, and it's a big one. Don't criticize, condemn, or complain. Now, this might sound pretty obvious, but the book starts with some really powerful and actually kind of disturbing examples. Take, for instance, the case of Two Gun Crowley. He was a notorious cop killer in New York City.
Oh, wow.
And even as he was facing the electric chair, about to be executed, he never accepted any blame. He genuinely believed that he was just defending himself.
That's incredible. And what's interesting is that wasn't an isolated case. The book, it goes on to talk about Al Capone, public enemy number one. And he saw himself as someone who was just providing people with lighter pleasures, and he felt like he was being misunderstood and abused. The key takeaway here, and this is like a fundamental insight about human nature, is that we have this very strong tendency to justify our actions no matter what we've done.
It's true.
And to avoid taking personal responsibility for our mistakes.
Yeah.
And recognizing this in ourselves and in others is really the first step to understanding why criticism is often so ineffective.
Exactly. And then, the book kind of shifts gears a little bit, and it talks about more everyday scenarios, like John Wanamaker. He's the founder of, those famous department stores.
Mm-hmm.
And he came to the realization that scolding people, it was a waste of energy.
Yeah.
He figured he had enough on his plate just trying to manage his own faults and limitations.
So what's so important for you to take away from that is that criticism, it rarely leads to any positive change. And it often ends up damaging relationships.
Absolutely.
Wanamaker's decision to focus on his own growth, instead of pointing fingers at everyone else, that's a really valuable lesson in how to interact with people effectively.
And then for a really dramatic illustration of this principle, the book brings up the Teapot Dome oil scandal.
Oh, wow. That's going back a bit.
Yeah, it's a big one. Albert B. Fall, he was the Secretary of the Interior, and he essentially handed over these incredibly valuable government oil reserves in exchange for, a hefty loan.
Right.
And despite all the public outrage and the legal consequences, he actually ended up going to prison.
Wow.
But there's really no indication that he ever truly recognized that what he did was wrong.
That's a pretty extreme example of how deeply ingrained this tendency to avoid self-blame can be,
Yeah.
Even when the consequences are huge and the wrongdoing is obvious to everyone else,
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, how often we might be doing the same thing ourselves, even in smaller ways.
It's a little unsettling to think about.
Yeah, it is.
But then the book offers kind of a more hopeful perspective, and it uses the example of Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, interesting.
So early in his life, he was actually known to be pretty sharp-tongued and critical.
Huh.
He even wrote these satirical letters and poems that could be really cutting,
Wow.
But he actually made a conscious effort to change that part of himself.
That's amazing. What's really fascinating there for you to consider is that Lincoln recognized the damage that his early critical nature was doing. And he deliberately worked to become more understanding and more restrained in his judgments.
Yeah.
And even when he was dealing with like a really intense situation, like after General Meade didn't decisively pursue Lee after the Battle of Gettysburg,
Yeah.
he wrote this letter that was critical, but the tone was very measured, especially for Lincoln at that point in his life.
So he had really kind of grown and evolved.
Right. It shows personal growth.
Yeah. And then this principle is illustrated really beautifully in a short story called Father Forgets. It's about a father who spends his days constantly finding fault with his young son over little things.
Oh, wow.
Just being critical. And then later, when he sees his son sleeping peacefully, he's just overcome with this deep sense of regret and love. He realizes how much he's been focused on the negative and how much he's overlooked the innocence and affection.
That story, that really hits home. It shows you the emotional toll that constant criticism can take. not just on the person receiving it, but on the person giving it too.
Right.
It's a good reminder for you to really shift your focus towards the positive things about the people around you.
Absolutely. So this first principle really sets the stage, right? If you want to build strong, positive relationships, put a lid on the criticism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to principle 2, and it's a big one. Give honest and sincere appreciation.
Oh, this is a good one.
Now, the book actually calls this the big secret of dealing with people. And it's all about making people genuinely want to do things.
What's so fascinating about this principle is that it taps into some really deep psychological drivers. The book touches upon Freud's idea about the desire to be great and Dewey's concept of the desire to be important. These are fundamental human urges. And the principle suggests that you can tap into these desires through sincere appreciation.
Yeah.
And that's far more effective in motivating people than using like threats or coercion.
Exactly. And the book immediately kind of contrasts this with a story about Andrew Carnegie's nephews. So he left them notes outlining tasks he wanted them to do, and he included checks as an incentive, to get them to do the work. But he didn't offer any genuine appreciation or acknowledgement of their efforts. And guess what? The checks remained unused.
Wow. That's a powerful anecdote. It really shows you that just expecting things from people, even those close to you, without acknowledging their effort or offering genuine appreciation, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
There needs to be that emotional connection.
Absolutely. Then we get this really relatable example from a father named Stan Novak. He was struggling to get his young son, Tim, excited about starting kindergarten.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic struggle.
Right. So instead of forcing him or focusing on the academic stuff, Stan completely shifted his approach.
Yeah.
He started talking about all the fun things Tim would get to do: finger painting, singing songs, making new friends.
Oh, I love that. That's such a great illustration of how you can shift your focus from what you want to what the other person wants.
Yeah.
And then frame the situation in those terms.
Exactly.
It's about finding that sweet spot where your needs and their desires align.
And then the story about negotiating the rent for a hotel ballroom, that's like a masterclass in this principle.
Right.
So Carnegie, he wasn't focused on arguing for a lower price based on his own needs.
Right.
Instead, he made the whole conversation about the hotel manager's desire to have the ballroom available for more profitable events. And he did that by offering to let the manager use the ballroom for free for certain nonprofit events.
That's brilliant. So by framing it in terms of the manager's interests, he got a big rent reduction without even having to explicitly state what he wanted.
Exactly.
Yep.
And the book then gives some examples of poorly written letters, like one from an advertising agency and one from a freight terminal superintendent. And in these letters, the senders were totally focused on their own needs. They completely ignored the recipient's perspective.
So what these examples show you is that self-centered communication just doesn't work.
Right.
People are naturally more interested in their own concerns than in yours.
It's true.
So, when you only talk about we want or we desire, your message is going to fall flat.
Yeah. Contrast that with the story about Barbara Anderson's job application letter. So instead of talking about what she wanted in a job, she researched all the banks in Phoenix, and then she tailored her letter to highlight how her specific skills and experience could benefit each bank.
Oh, smart.
And guess what?
What?
11 out of 12 banks offered her interviews.
Wow. That's a fantastic example of how shifting your focus from what you want from others to what you can offer them can really increase your chances of success. Whether it's, a job application, a business deal, any kind of interaction.
And the book points out that this unselfish service, this genuine focus on other people, it's actually pretty rare.
Yeah.
And that gives you a huge advantage. There's a great quote from Owen D. Young, and he said, "You can get anything in life you want if you will just help enough other people get what they want."
That's so true. But it's important to remember that there's a difference between genuine appreciation and just flattery, or manipulation.
Right.
True influence, it comes from a place of sincerity.
Yeah.
Where both sides actually gain something positive from the interaction. It's about creating win-win situations.
Absolutely. And we see this, in the charming story of the underweight boy who was finally motivated to eat, not by being nagged, but by his parents framing it around his own desire to grow big and strong enough to ride a pony.
cute.
Yeah,
That's a perfect example of how you can tap into a child's world and frame your requests in a way that resonates with them.
exactly. And then there's the father who got his daughter to eat her breakfast by letting her imitate her mother, making her feel all grown up by preparing it herself.
Oh, I love that. It's all about making them feel empowered.
Exactly. And it all comes back to this fundamental idea that people are primarily interested in themselves. I mean, there was a study done by the New York Telephone Company, and they found that I is the most frequently used word in conversations.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful statistic. It's a reminder that we're all naturally self-focused.
Yeah. And Alfred Adler, he said, individuals who have no interest in their fellow beings are more apt to find life difficult.
Mm-hmm.
They are the ones who have problems.
That's insightful.
And then the book, it beautifully illustrates the impact of showing genuine interest with the story of Theodore Roosevelt and his valet's wife. So, Roosevelt, he went out of his way to share this specific piece of information with her about a bobwhite bird because he knew it would be something that she would be particularly interested in.
That's so sweet. It's those little things, those thoughtful gestures that show you genuinely care that can really create a strong bond with people.
Yeah.
And Carnegie himself, he used this principle all the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like to get access to really busy and influential authors, he would just express sincere admiration for their work.
Oh, wow.
And then they'd open up to him. And there's a story about Mrs. Rosedale. She was fiercely loyal to her bank, and it was all because a bank employee just asked her a simple, genuine question about her mother's health.
It's remarkable how these small acts of kindness can have such a lasting impact.
They really can.
And then there's this great story about a guy named C.M. Naffel Jr. He was a fuel salesman, and he managed to sell fuel to a chain store executive who he actually didn't even like.
Oh, how do you do that?
Well, he did something kind of surprising. He asked the executive for a favor. He needed help preparing for a debate. And by doing that, by showing that vulnerability, by seeking his help, it completely shifted their dynamic, and he ended up getting a big order.
That's so interesting. It's like that old saying, we are interested in others when they are interested in us.
Exactly. And then there's this really heartwarming story about a student nurse on Thanksgiving. She goes out of her way to show genuine care and attention to a lonely patient.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's those moments of true human connection that really matter,
Absolutely. So principle 2, it's really about shifting your focus outward.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding what motivates people and offering sincere appreciation for who they are and what they do.
You got it.
It's about making people feel genuinely valued and important.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
All right, principle 3. Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. This one might seem kind of small, but the book really emphasizes how powerful this is, and it immediately connects this to the power of a genuine smile.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot to that.
Right. I mean, there's a quote from Professor James V. McConnell, and he says that people who smile tend to manage better, teach better, and sell better.
That makes sense.
And even those phone power training programs, where they teach you how to sound better on the phone.
Yeah.
They emphasize the importance of smiling while you're talking.
It's interesting to think about the real impact of something as simple as a smile.
Yeah.
Like, there's this story about a department store, and they'd rather hire a clerk who smiles than someone with a PhD who's always frowning.
Right. And then there's this other story about a job applicant, and he chose to work for a specific company just because the manager's voice on the phone sounded genuinely happy to hear from him.
It's about creating that positive feeling.
Absolutely.
And the chairman of this big rubber company, he even said that people rarely succeed unless they genuinely enjoy what they're doing.
Right.
It's about having that positive attitude.
Absolutely. And there's this compelling story about this businessman who, he was always grumpy, but he decided to make a conscious effort to smile more. And it actually transformed his whole life.
That's incredible. It really shows you the power of a deliberate shift in attitude. And there's this old Chinese proverb. It says, a man without a smiling face must not open a shop.
Yeah.
And there's another example about a department store in New York City. They really believed in the value of a smile, especially around Christmas.
Yeah, it makes a difference.
It really does. And then, the book delves into this almost magical power of names.
Yeah.
And they give this amazing example of Jim Farley. He could call like 50,000 people by their first names.
Wow.
Can you imagine? And that was a huge factor in Franklin D. Roosevelt's political success. I mean, just think about that.
That's incredible.
It really shows you the power of making people feel seen and recognized and important.
Yeah.
And Andrew Carnegie, he was a master of this. Like, there's this story about how he used a guy named Pullman's name strategically during a merger negotiation, and it was really effective.
Interesting. And even Roosevelt, he remembered a mechanic's name after just a brief interaction.
It's those little things.
It is. It's about making people feel valued, even in seemingly insignificant interactions.
Exactly. The book emphasizes that remembering and using people's names makes them feel important. It even mentions that Napoleon III had this elaborate system for memorizing names.
Ah.
And there's a great quote from Emerson, "Good manners are made up of petty sacrifices."
So true.
So Napoleon III's system, it shows you that remembering names often takes effort, but it's worth it because it builds goodwill. And Emerson's quote, it reminds us that these small acts of consideration, they can have a really big impact on people.
Absolutely. And then there's this heartwarming story about a cafeteria worker named Eunice. And she was always kind of grumpy. But this guy, Ken Nottingham, he started using her name when he'd see her, and it completely changed her attitude. She became much more friendly and generous.
That's a beautiful example of how powerful a name can be.
It really is.
Yeah.
The book rightly points out that a person's name is something unique and deeply personal to them.
It's a form of validation. It turns a simple interaction into a real human connection.
Absolutely. Okay, principle 4, be a good listener. Encourage
Okay.
others to talk about themselves. This one really resonated with me, and I think it will with you too. There's this anecdote about Dale Carnegie, and he went to a dinner party, and he was labeled as a really interesting conversationalist. But all he did was listen intently to a botanist for hours.
That's so funny. It really shows you that being a good conversationalist isn't about dominating the conversation.
Yeah.
It's about actively listening,
Yeah.
and making the other person feel heard and understood. And there's a quote from Charles W. Eliot, the former president of Harvard, and he emphasized the importance of giving someone your exclusive attention.
Absolutely.
And then Henry James, he actually described Eliot's listening style. He was just so present, so engaged.
And then there's a story about a guy named Mr. Detmer. And he had this really angry customer, just complaining about everything.
Oh, yeah.
And Mr. Detmer just let the customer vent, just let him talk it all out.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, by letting him feel heard, the customer completely calmed down. He even placed a bigger order and became a loyal customer.
That's a great example of how powerful active listening can be in a business setting. It's almost like a way to diffuse anger and build rapport.
Absolutely.
And it can even lead to unexpected positive outcomes. And, Dale Carnegie himself, early in his life, he wanted to educate himself. And he did that by corresponding with all these famous and influential people, presidents, authors, you name it.
Wow.
And he was successful because he focused on asking them about themselves and being a genuinely good listener.
So he really applied this principle in his own life.
He did. And there's a description of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst, and he was known as an exceptional listener.
That makes sense.
It makes you realize how important attentive listening is, especially when you're trying to really understand another person.
And then the book quotes Dr. Nicholas Murray Butler. He was the former president of Columbia University.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that people who only talk about themselves are hopelessly uneducated.
That's a pretty strong statement.
Right. It really emphasizes the importance of having that back and forth, that genuine interest in other people.
It's about being curious about the people around you.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
So this principle boils down to actively asking questions that other people enjoy answering and encouraging them to talk about their accomplishments and their experiences, their interests.
Yeah, definitely. It's good to remember that people are generally far more interested in their own lives than they are in yours.
Right. And there's a story about a bread salesman, and he spent 4 years trying to get an order from a hotel. He just couldn't crack it.
Mm-hmm.
But then he finally changed his approach. Instead of talking about the bread, he started asking the hotel steward about his interests. And guess what? He got the order.
That's so smart. It's about shifting the conversation to focus on the other person.
Exactly. And then there's another story about a guy named Edward E. Harriman. And he wanted to get a job with this guy, R.J. Funkhauser. So he did all this research about Funkhauser's interests, and he approached him on that basis.
Oh, interesting.
Right, and they had this great conversation, that Funkhauser really enjoyed, and he ended up getting the job.
So it's about making the other person feel important, like their interests matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's a story about a teacher, Mr. Rolland, and he saw this hidden potential in a shy student named Chris. And instead of just letting Chris blend into the background, he offered him a spot in the advanced class.
Oh, wow.
And it was all because he truly believed in Chris and wanted him to feel important and capable.
That's such a great example of how being a good listener and showing genuine belief in someone can really help them unlock their potential.
Yeah,
It's about paying attention not just to what they say, but to what they don't say, to their unspoken desires and potential.
absolutely. All right, principle 5. Talk in terms of the other person's interests. This one builds on that idea of being a good listener, right?
Hmm.
And there's this really interesting anecdote about a lawyer in Connecticut. He unexpectedly received a Packard car as a gift from his elderly aunt.
Wow.
And he got this lavish gift simply by admiring her possessions and focusing the conversation on her feelings and her desire for recognition.
It's a great example of how focusing on what the other person is passionate about, what they value, can lead to really positive outcomes.
Yeah. And then there's a story about a guy named James Adamson, and he needed to secure a $90,000 order from George Eastman, who was known to be pretty difficult to deal with.
Mhm.
But Adamson was smart. He admired Eastman's office, he asked about Eastman's philanthropic work, and by talking about things that Eastman was interested in, he made him feel important.
So even in a tough business negotiation, taking the time to understand the other person's passions and achievements can be really effective.
Yeah, it's more powerful than just pushing your own agenda.
Absolutely.
And then there's this story about a manager named Claude Murray. He had a really valuable employee who was thinking about leaving.
Oh, no.
But instead of, begging her to stay or making promises, he did something really clever. He expressed sincere appreciation for her work, and then he subtly shifted the conversation to talk about how much her leaving would impact him and the team.
That's smart. So even when you have to address your own concerns, framing it in terms of the other person's value and impact can be a really persuasive way to get what you want.
And make them feel appreciated.
Exactly.
Okay, principle 6 is really short, but it's super important. Make the other person feel important and do it sincerely. The book really emphasizes that sincerity.